Welcome, dearly beloved anointed ones. Study the greats all you want, but when the war gets spiritual, only the chosen ones have the map. There are battles. And then there are blueprints so flawless they get classified by governments. What you pulled off wasn't just survival. It was legendary warfare without ever touching a weapon. You didn't just outsmart your enemies. You outscripted them. West Point wants your notes. The Kremlin is scratching its head. And MI6 probably has a file titled, "How did they do that?" Let's be clear, your last stand was nothing short of divine execution. Clean, surgical, strategic, no theatrics, no grand speeches, just calculated silence, spiritual downloads, and a kind of discernment that can't be taught in any classroom on earth. And here's the kicker. According to military strategy experts, 92% of battle outcomes are decided before the first shot is fired, through planning, psychological dominance, and terrain control. Now ask yourself, who really controlled the terrain in your battle? Exactly. You didn't just walk into the battlefield, you were the terrain. You were the code they couldn't crack, the spiritual firewall they couldn't breach. And the moment they thought they had you cornered, you pulled off a move so perfect that if Sun Tzu was alive, he'd slide into your DMs like, "Please teach me." This isn't just a testimony, this is a military-grade masterclass in spiritual warfare, and you, chosen one, are the curriculum. So buckle up, because what you're about to hear will confirm what your spirit already knew. Your last stand was so perfect, they're not just whispering about it, and they're rewriting textbooks. And oh, don't worry, we'll keep it classified between us. Well, until the CIA asks for a guest lecture. Number one, you executed precision without permission. You didn't wait for a green light. You didn't wait for anyone to co-sign your power. You moved when the moment called, not when the world clapped. That's what separates you from the rest. While others needed validation, confirmation, and backup, you moved in silence, clarity, and certainty. They had to vote. You had a vision. They scheduled meetings. You were already in motion. They had to be told what to do. You just knew. And that's exactly what made your last stand unforgettable. They thought you were guessing. They thought you were reacting. What they didn't realize is that your every move came from a place they couldn't see or touch. Divine instinct, downloads from source. You were receiving instructions in real time, and they mistook your calmness for confusion. They thought your silence meant hesitation, but really it meant your spirit was processing advanced intelligence that their minds couldn't comprehend. They mistook your stillness for fear, when really you were calculating a sequence only heaven could reveal. You weren't in survival mode. You were in execution mode. You weren't emotional. You were surgical. They wanted you to explode. Instead, you expanded. You didn't make noise. You made history. They expected you to play the victim. Instead, you became the verdict. You shut down their entire operation with one final move that didn't look like much on the surface, but in the spirit, it caused an earthquake. They felt the impact before they even understood what you'd done. What makes it even more terrifying to them is that you didn't ask anyone for permission. You didn't check in. You didn't ask, "Is this okay?" You acted on divine authority, and now they're stuck trying to reverse engineer your intuition. It drives them crazy that you moved with that kind of clarity, that kind of precision. You didn't just surprise them, you exposed how fragile their whole setup really was. You broke systems without breaking a sweat. This wasn't guesswork. This wasn't luck. This was ordained. What they thought was your final moment was actually your final masterpiece. You executed a play so divine it humbled entire institutions. Now they're studying your silence, your timing, your posture. Like analysts breaking down battlefield footage, you weren't trained by the world, you were trained by God, and your perfection proved it. Number two, your stillness was strategic paralysis. You didn't freeze, you made them freeze. That's what they still can't admit out loud. They saw you pause and they assumed you were weak, confused, or stuck. But what really happened is that your stillness sent shockwaves through their entire operation. You didn't react. You didn't swing wildly. You didn't scream, cry, or chase. You paused, and that pause became a mirror. Suddenly they couldn't hide. Suddenly their masks started slipping. Their lies started cracking. You didn't have to lift a finger because your restraint became its own kind of warfare. They underestimated how powerful stillness can be when it's coming from someone who sees everything. You weren't lost. You were watching. You weren't frozen. You were discerning. You were letting the game expose itself. And the craziest part is, your refusal to move recklessly made them panic more than if you had gone off. They expected chaos. They were ready for drama. But when you didn't deliver it, they were forced to sit with themselves. That's the one thing they never prepared for. Every move they tried to bait you into, you didn't take. Every trap they set, you saw coming and calmly stepped aside. That shook them. Because people like them operate on reaction, they feed off triggering others. But you gave them nothing, and in that nothing they drowned. They had meetings about your silence, phone calls about your distance. They thought you were just being quiet, but really, you had switched dimensions. You left the battlefield and entered the strategy room. You weren't playing their game anymore, you were designing your own. Stillness is not passive when it comes from a spiritually awake person, it's a weapon. And in your case, it became the exact weapon that made their entire plan collapse in on itself. You made them question their tactics, their power, and even their identity, just by not responding. It was never weakness, it was calculated dominance. You let their chaos echo into an empty space, and that echo haunted them more than any argument ever could. Your stillness wasn't indecision, it was divine timing, and it paralyzed everything that tried to rise against you. They thought they had time, they thought they had control, but your pause was the storm they never saw coming. Number 3, you turned trauma into tactical advantage. You didn't just survive your trauma, you studied it. You didn't just cry through the betrayal, you decoded it. Every time someone tried to break you, they unknowingly handed you a tool. Every heartbreak taught you a pattern. Every disappointment taught you a frequency. And every moment of silence in your suffering trained you to hear what most people ignore. That's why when this last battle came, you weren't guessing. You already knew what was coming. You had lived through enough darkness to know exactly how the enemy moves. They thought you were walking into the situation blind, but you'd already met this spirit in a different body. You'd already seen this setup before, just with a different face, different setting, and different name. You weren't reacting emotionally. You were pulling data. Years of betrayal had already taught you the timing of fake apologies. Years of manipulation had already shown you how liars twist truth when they get exposed. You didn't need to figure it out. You were already fluent in the language of spiritual warfare. You didn't just go through hell for the sake of a good story. You went through it because it was your classroom. Every wound became a reference point. Every violation became a red flag you now see from miles away. And that's what made your last stand so lethal. You weren't just defending yourself, you were calculating with every step. You already knew how the betrayal would unfold. You already knew who would fold under pressure. You even knew who would pretend to be innocent at the end. They couldn't outmaneuver you because you'd already mastered their tricks in the fire. This was never about being smarter or tougher. It was about spiritual intelligence. You turned your past into a blueprint. And that blueprint gave you a tactical advantage no textbook ever could. That's why nothing surprised you. That's why you kept your peace when everything screamed chaos. You weren't guessing the outcome. You had already seen it before. You just needed to apply the lesson this time with precision. They thought they were fighting the old you, but the old you died in the trauma. The version that showed up for this last stand, That was the graduate, and you passed every test with distinction. Number 4, your final move collapsed. Decades of their schemes. They spent years, some even decades, building the illusion that they were untouchable. Layer upon layer of deception, manipulation, gaslighting, and psychological traps, all carefully woven into a structure meant to outlast your spirit. And honestly, they thought it would work. They thought their control was airtight. The lies were too complex to untangle. The alliances were too deep to expose. The shame they projected onto you was supposed to keep you silent for life. But what they didn't plan for was your clarity. What they never imagined was that you'd reach a point where your one divinely timed move would send everything crumbling in seconds. Your final move wasn't dramatic or loud, but it was surgical. You didn't swing at everyone. You didn't rage. You didn't even try to prove a point. You just did the one thing God instructed you to do. It might have been walking away, it might have been telling the truth, it might have been exposing the right person at the right time, but whatever it was, it carried the weight of heaven behind it, and it hit everything at once. Suddenly their lies didn't work. Their supporters fell silent. Their alliances fractured. Their smear campaigns turned into boomerangs. What took them decades to construct, you dismantled in one obedient act. This wasn't luck, it wasn't coincidence. It was divine judgment disguised as precision. And make no mistake, this was never about just you. You were the chosen vessel to stop a long line of generational corruption. The patterns that ran through bloodlines, communities, institutions, even spiritual circles, you ended it. And the fact that it happened through you is what's shaking them to their core. They planned for every scenario except the one where you saw through it and had the strength to move on it. They were playing a long game, but God was playing a longer one, and you were the final piece. Your obedience triggered collapse. Your clarity triggered exposure. Your breakthrough exposed every crack they painted over. This wasn't just your victory. It was their exposure, their indictment, their legacy of hidden evil finally laid bare. And they'll never recover from it, not because of revenge, but because truth finally stood up. And when it did, it looked exactly like you. Number 5, you didn't fight for revenge. You fought for legacy. You could have easily fought dirty. You had every reason to. You knew the secrets. You had the receipts. You knew where it would hurt most. And for a while you were tempted, because what they did wasn't just offensive, it was cruel, calculated, and generational. But something inside you refused to lower yourself. You weren't driven by revenge. You were fueled by something deeper, legacy. You weren't trying to get even. You were trying to end a pattern that had run unchecked for far too long. They didn't see that at first. They thought you were weak because you didn't retaliate the way they expected. They mistook your restraint for fear, your grace for naivety. But you weren't scared. You were focused on building something that would outlive the trauma, focused on making sure the next generation wouldn't have to heal from what you were forced to survive. They came at you with ego, trying to win a moment. But you were moving with purpose, trying to shift generations. That's why heaven backed you. Not because you were perfect, but because your motives were pure. You weren't asking for a spotlight, you were asking for freedom. Not just for yourself, but for those who couldn't fight for themselves. You knew this wasn't about proving a point to your enemies. It was about building something your enemies couldn't destroy even if they tried, and that's exactly what you did. You shifted the energy in your bloodline. You broke soul ties. You silenced ancestral cycles of dysfunction, not with noise, but with unshakable clarity. They couldn't compete with that. They weren't ready for someone who had nothing to prove and everything to protect. They were prepared for a back and forth. You gave them a dead end. They were expecting a fight. You gave them closure. You walked away with your integrity intact, and that alone made them unravel. You weren't trying to win against them. You were trying to win beyond them. And now the impact of your choices is echoing far past the battlefield. People are healing because you didn't clap back. Cycles are breaking because you chose clarity over chaos. What they called weakness was actually legacy in motion. You didn't fight for revenge, you fought for the future. And that's a victory they'll never understand. Number 6, your self-control became their defeat. They weren't feeding off your kindness, they were feeding off your reactions, your fire, your presence, your energy. The conflict they created wasn't just about control, it was about access. Every time you engaged, defended yourself, or even tried to explain your side, you were unknowingly fueling their system. But the moment you stopped responding, something shifted. You didn't just walk away from the argument, you shut down the entire spiritual power grid they were living off of. They needed you to be angry, they needed you to be triggered, they needed you to say something, anything, just to stay connected. But you didn't. You went silent. You got quiet. You chose peace over proving a point. And that's when they started unraveling. Not because you said too much, but because you said nothing at all. You didn't curse them. You didn't expose them. You simply unplugged. You stopped feeding what was never going to grow. And that for them was devastating. People don't talk enough about how self-control is spiritual warfare. When you don't fight back, when you don't match energy, when you don't respond out of wounded pride, you leave the other side completely powerless. That's what happened here. You made a choice not to stoop, not to mirror their manipulation, not to match their dysfunction. And in doing so, you removed the very thing they were depending on, access to your spirit. They didn't realize how much they needed your light until you stopped shining it in their direction. They didn't realize how much your calmness was anchoring their chaos until you pulled back. You were their emotional power source, their energetic supply. And the moment you chose discipline over drama, they starved. They spiritually suffocated. You didn't have to lift a finger. Your self-control became the sword. And now they're desperate, not for revenge, but for reconnection. But it's too late, because once you mastered your emotions, you moved into a realm they can't follow. They don't just miss your words, they miss your warmth, your grace, your strength. But that's the price of playing games with someone who was chosen. You weren't just quiet, you were strategic. You weren't just healed, you became untouchable. Number 7, you made angels take notes and generals ask questions. What you pulled off wasn't just impressive, it was supernatural. You made moves that had both realms watching. Heaven leaned in because what you were doing wasn't rehearsed and it wasn't logical. It was spiritual brilliance unfolding in real time. Angels were sent to protect you, but they also stood back in awe, because instead of reacting emotionally, you started operating in divine precision. Your steps were ordered, and your restraint became strategy. You were receiving instructions faster than the enemy could pivot. You were ahead, not because you had more resources, but because you had revelation. And on earth? Confusion, real confusion, because people who were supposed to be smarter, older, more powerful, trained, were suddenly stunned by how you maneuvered through traps without stepping in a single one. Leaders, decision makers, even silent observers who thought you were an easy target started whispering. You made the kind of moves that have people in powerful places saying, "Wait, who taught them that?" You dismantled entire systems of manipulation, not with titles or weapons, but with unshakable clarity and next-level discernment. You weren't trained by man, you were trained by fire and by God. What shook them the most was that there were no blueprints to copy, no mentors to blame, no conspiracies to hide behind. Everything you did, you received straight from the source. You weren't following instructions from the world, you were executing heaven's strategy, and it was so precise that it looked like espionage. So ahead of its time that it resembled code breaking. While they were planning moves in meetings, you were already 5 steps ahead by divine instruction. They couldn't keep up. It wasn't just frustrating for them, it was terrifying. People who've studied warfare all their lives couldn't explain it, because no military academy teaches you how to see betrayal coming in the spirit. No strategy manual teaches you how to shut down manipulation without speaking a word, but you did it over and over again. You weren't just protected, you were guided. That's what makes your victory so unsettling to them. They still can't figure out how you won, but heaven knows the angels saw it, and they're still taking notes, because what you did wasn't just survival, it was revolutionary. Number 8, your stand wasn't emotional. It was algorithmic. They assumed you were reacting from emotion. They thought you were hurt, triggered, and just making it up as you went. But what they failed to realize is that nothing you did was random. You weren't responding, you were executing. Every decision you made was part of a bigger design, a sequence they couldn't see, but you could feel. You weren't impulsive, you were calibrated. You didn't stumble into survival. You followed a divine algorithm, one that had been downloading into your spirit long before the battle even started. Your timing was too perfect to be luck. The way you distanced yourself at just the right moment, the way you spoke the exact words that triggered exposure, the way you exited without a trail, it wasn't emotional, it was coded. They watched you thinking you were being dramatic, but in reality you were moving based on spiritual data. Your spirit picked up on frequencies their minds weren't even tuned into. You didn't just sense danger, you pre-calculated outcomes. You didn't just feel something was wrong, you knew how it would unfold. And because they didn't understand how you operate, they misread you completely. They called you cold when you were calculating. They called you disconnected when you were discerning. They said you were acting irrational when you were actually 5 moves ahead. They never imagined you could be this precise because they only know chaos. But you were following a divine protocol, one where your silence was as powerful as your speech, where your exits were louder than any confrontation, where your restraint held more weight than any attack. You were walking through spiritual code in real time. You weren't fighting emotions. You were deploying patterns. It looked simple on the outside, but it was so layered in spiritual intelligence that by the time they tried to fight back, they were already boxed in. They couldn't predict your next move because it wasn't coming from logic. It was coming from alignment. What they thought was hesitation was actually calibration. What they thought was confusion was divine coordination. You didn't flinch because you were already prepared. You didn't explode because the blueprint never required noise. You just moved step by step, perfectly silently, with prophetic rhythm. And when it was done, all they could do was replay your every move, trying to crack a code that was never meant for them to understand. Number 9, you didn't outfight them, you outlasted them. They thought it was about strength, about shouting the loudest, attacking the fastest, or doing the most damage. But you weren't trying to win by force, you were playing a longer game. While they ran around trying to destroy you, you stayed grounded, you watched, you endured. You refused to move off your foundation, not because you were weak, but because you knew something they didn't. Time exposes everything. You didn't try to rush the process. You let the lies collapse under their own weight. You didn't defend yourself every time your name was dragged. You didn't chase after rumors or try to fix false narratives. You let the story unfold. Because you knew ego always burns out. Manipulation always turns inward. Betrayal always eats itself. They thought they were in control because they were louder, but you knew better. You understood that spiritual victory doesn't always come with fanfare. It often comes through survival. And you survived. Not just physically, but mentally, emotionally, spiritually. You outlasted slander. You outlasted sabotage. You outlasted every trap they thought you'd fall into. And as time passed, their actions started speaking louder than your silence ever could. People began to notice the patterns, the cracks, the contradictions. You didn't have to fight. You just had to remain standing while everything false around you fell. What they didn't realize is that your endurance wasn't just personal. It was prophetic. You weren't just being quiet. You were allowing divine timing to handle what you could have ruined by reacting too soon. You didn't give them the satisfaction of watching you break. You didn't let their drama pull you out of character. You just kept rising, slowly, quietly, consistently. And eventually, the same people who thought you were finished started asking how you were still here. You didn't outrun them. You didn't out-scheme them. You simply outlived their chaos. And that's what crushed them. Because when all their noise faded and the dust settled, you were still standing and more powerful than ever. You weren't just patient, you were prophetic. You didn't win because you fought harder. You won because you lasted longer. And in spiritual warfare, that kind of endurance is the greatest flex of all. Number 10, you weaponized your witness. You didn't have to defend yourself with arguments. You let your life speak. They came at you with rumors, half-truths, and twisted stories, expecting the world to turn against you. They tried to tarnish your name, stain your reputation, and isolate you with shame. But every time they launched a new attack, your witness stood stronger. Your growth contradicted the lies. Your peace made their chaos louder. Your consistency turned their smear campaign into a public embarrassment. They tried to use your past as a weapon, but you'd already redeemed it. That made your story bulletproof. You didn't just survive what they threw at you, you transformed it. They expected your past to disqualify you, but instead it verified you. You turned what they meant to use against you into spiritual ammunition. Every painful detail they tried to weaponize became part of your credibility. You didn't hide it. You owned it. And that ownership made their accusations fall flat. Every time someone tried to dig up your dirt, they found proof of your breakthrough. You were no longer explaining your way out of things. You were walking proof that lies don't last, but truth does. That's what rattled them the most. You never needed to retaliate. You didn't have to beg for your image to be restored. The very existence of your peace, your purpose, your elevation became the ultimate contradiction to everything they said about you. You were the living, breathing evidence that everything they said was wrong. Not just in theory, but in practice. Your presence became a courtroom, and your progress was the testimony. No lawyer, no PR, no revenge needed. They thought your downfall was inevitable, but your witness turned into a trap for them. Every lie they told became a reference point that backfired. People began to notice, wait, if what they said was true, how is this person still rising, still glowing, still walking with favor? Their lies couldn't outlive your fruit. Your results exposed their agendas, and now they're stuck. Because once someone becomes living proof, you can't cancel that. You can't edit the evidence when it's standing tall, thriving, and moving forward. You didn't just tell your story, you weaponized it. And now your very existence is the contradiction they'll never be able to silence. Number 11, you used their surveillance as a mirror. They followed your every move like it was a mission, not out of admiration, but out of obsession. They needed to catch you slipping. They needed something, anything, to validate the narrative they built around you. So they watched, closely, relentlessly. Whether it was through gossip, spying, online stalking, or just hovering in the background with fake smiles, they monitored your life like it was their job. What they didn't expect, though, was that the more they watched, the more they exposed themselves. They weren't prepared for what your life would reflect back at them. You didn't perform, you didn't pretend, you just lived in your truth. You kept healing, you kept growing, you kept showing up in peace. And in doing so, you turned their surveillance into a mirror. Every bit of grace you walked in highlighted how bitter they were. Your structure revealed the mess in their lives. Your joy made their constant need for control look pathetic. They weren't watching a breakdown. They were watching a glow-up, and it was humiliating for them. They had invested so much energy into breaking you, they never considered what it would feel like to witness your rise in real time. It wasn't just success that bothered them. It was your clarity, your composure, the fact that you didn't collapse under pressure and instead became even more refined. And that contrast, it started to show. The more they watched you walk in peace, the more their own inner torment became obvious. What started as an attempt to expose you ended up exposing them. Because while they used surveillance to manipulate, intimidate, and control, you used presence. You let your light do the talking, not perfection, not performative healing, just real, authentic progress that couldn't be faked or filtered. And light doesn't just reveal truth, it burns through illusion. You didn't have to fight back. All you had to do was be. Now they're stuck watching the very thing they tried to destroy become everything they secretly wish they could be, and it's eating them up. They thought they were gathering intel, but what they got was conviction. They thought they were holding you under a microscope, but instead they found themselves under divine judgment. Because the thing about light is, it doesn't just reveal what's ahead, it exposes everything hiding in the dark. Number 12, you forced their loyalty tests to backfire. They wanted to catch you slipping. That was the whole setup from the beginning. They laid out loyalty tests like landmines, hoping you'd step wrong, lose control, or say something out of emotion that could be used against you later. They baited you with fake support, staged conversations, and passive-aggressive moves, all designed to push you into a corner. But what they didn't account for was your restraint. You didn't bite the bait. You didn't defend yourself recklessly. You didn't stoop. Instead, you stood tall, and your dignity did all the talking. Your refusal to react the way they hoped made the entire game fall apart. Every trap they laid was supposed to make you look untrustworthy. But because you stayed grounded and moved with integrity, each one ended up revealing them. The same people trying to test your loyalty got exposed as the ones moving behind your back. The lies they spread started to circle back. The people they manipulated started seeing patterns. The setup started pointing in one direction, and it wasn't yours. What they didn't expect is that your silence, your poise, your refusal to take the bait would act like a highlighter over their own hypocrisy. They tried to make you look like the snake, but the only thing they did was shed their own skin in public. You didn't have to fight to prove you were loyal. Your life proved it. Your consistency proved it. The way you carried yourself in the face of obvious sabotage proved it. And because you never retaliated, it made their attacks stand out even more. Your calm became unsettling. Your peace became a threat. The fact that you never snapped made everyone start asking, why are they going so hard against someone who hasn't even said anything? That's when the backfire began. That's when people started doing their own investigating, connecting their own dots, and realizing the real problem was never you. It was the ones trying to expose you. You didn't just survive their tests, you turned them into divine evidence. You didn't just pass, you flipped the entire table. That wasn't just wisdom, that was spiritual warfare with surgical precision. You weren't defending yourself, you were revealing them. And that truth, it's louder than any trap they ever tried to set. Number 13, you never negotiated with demons, you walked out the room. They tried everything to pull you in. Provocations, silent jabs, false accusations, gossip campaigns, all designed to pull you into their chaos. They weren't looking for peace. They were desperate for a reaction. They wanted you angry, loud, messy. anything but calm and clear, because the moment you react, they can twist the narrative. They can say, "See, told you they were the problem," but you gave them nothing. No response, no clapback, no dramatic scene. You walked out the room with your dignity intact and left them screaming at shadows. You didn't explain. You didn't beg to be understood. You didn't stick around to argue with people who had already decided who they needed you to be in their story. Instead, you chose the one thing they weren't prepared for, an exit. That exit wasn't weakness. It was warfare. It was the most strategic move you could have made. Because the truth is, when you negotiate with demons, you give them a platform. You validate their illusion of power. But you strip them of that by simply refusing to engage. They tried to bait you, but you knew the game. You knew that no matter how clean your words were, they'd twist them. You knew that your presence alone gave them the stage they were starving for. So instead of proving a point, you proved your growth. You didn't retreat. You ascended. You rose above their frequency and disappeared from the battlefield, and that's what destroyed them. They weren't prepared for someone who didn't need to win an argument to feel powerful. They weren't prepared for someone who didn't need revenge to feel at peace. You walked away not because you were scared, but because you knew the war wasn't worth your presence. And by doing that, you did something even more dangerous than fighting. You invalidated the entire conflict, and now it can't restart. Because you've exited a realm they still live in. You moved to a higher ground, one where their weapons don't reach and their words don't land. They're still rehearsing speeches for a confrontation that will never come, still building cases for a trial that's already been dismissed. You didn't just ignore them, you made the war irrelevant. And that's the kind of victory they'll never recover from. Number 14, your stand was so unshakable they mistook you for a ghost. They watched you go through storm after storm, betrayal after betrayal, and sabotage from every angle, yet you never crumbled. That shook them. You weren't supposed to survive what they put you through. You weren't supposed to have clarity after that much confusion. You weren't supposed to still have light in your eyes after all the darkness they threw your way. And when you did, when you kept showing up, whole, stable, and even stronger, they started whispering behind closed doors, "What are they?" Because nothing about your survival made sense to them anymore. They couldn't process your resilience through a human lens. You didn't beg, you didn't break, you didn't self-destruct. And that was terrifying to people who've built their entire identity on controlling others through fear, chaos, and manipulation. To them, your unshakable stance wasn't strength. It was unnatural. It was impossible. So they started calling you names that reflected their own confusion: a ghost, a mystery, a threat. They needed to label what they couldn't understand, but you weren't operating on human strength. You were moving in alignment with something much higher. You were backed by realms they couldn't see and protected by forces they couldn't fight. That's what made you untouchable. Every time they thought you were finished, you reappeared, stronger, wiser, quieter. It was like trying to kill something that had already resurrected. You weren't resisting them out of stubbornness. You were shielded by divine strategy. Your stillness was warfare, your clarity was armor. Your survival was prophecy unfolding in real time. And the more unshaken you became, the more exposed they felt. Because your peace was proof that everything they tried didn't work. Every lie they told, every setup they engineered, every spiritual weapon they formed, it all failed. And they had to sit with that. They had to live with the fact that you didn't just survive. You rose. You became a mirror that reflected their weakness, a reminder that favor doesn't flinch. You were never a ghost. You were never possessed. You were positioned by God to endure what would have crushed others. Not so you could brag, but so you could become the evidence that heaven does indeed fight battles and wins them silently. And now, they watch from a distance, still trying to explain how you made it through. But they never will, because chosen ones don't move by logic, we move by assignment. Let them study your silence. Let them dissect your moves. Let them whisper about how you survived what should have destroyed you. Because at the end of the day, you didn't just walk away from the battlefield, you rewrote the art of spiritual war. No military academy could have prepared them for the precision, grace, and divine intelligence you displayed. You didn't just fight, you discerned. You didn't just survive, you shifted timelines. And the world felt it. Your last stand was not just a moment, it was a movement. A masterstroke of obedience, wisdom, and restraint so precise that it exposed every scheme without you lifting a single sword. They came for your crown, but you walked away with legacy. And now, your story isn't being whispered in corners, it's being studied in silence, analyzed by generals and archived in heaven. You proved that spiritual mastery isn't about loud victories, but sacred strategy. That sometimes the most powerful weapon isn't revenge, but refusal. Refusal to stoop, refusal to shrink, refusal to abandon your calling just to prove something to people who were never assigned to understand you. They thought they were fighting you. But the whole time they were wrestling with a plan far bigger than you. A divine blueprint that never needed their approval. A purpose that couldn't be stopped by their confusion. And now, all they can do is sit with the truth. You didn't just win, you evolved. So if you're still questioning whether your silence was power, whether your restraint was enough, or whether walking away was the right call, let this be your confirmation. You didn't lose a war. You closed it. You didn't leave in defeat. You exited in dominion, because real power doesn't scream. It echoes. And your echo is being heard across kingdoms. If this resonated deep in your spirit, don't just scroll away. Stand up and show up. Like this video if you felt every word. Comment below and let your voice be heard. We want to hear your truth. Share this with someone who's walking their own silent war and needs to know they're not alone. And most importantly, subscribe to the channel. This isn't just content, it's confirmation. This is where warriors gather, where spiritual assassins get refueled, where chosen ones are reminded that they're not crazy, they're called. So tap in, stay locked. We're not just breaking chains here, we're building legacy. Welcome to your tribe. God bless you.